In this video, I'm going to walk you through all of the API tools and settings available to you in the Bubble editor. Keep in mind that some of these capabilities are only available to you once you've put your app on a paid plan, so be mindful of any messaging Bubble displays next to these settings so you're aware of what you have access to. Now, remember that Bubble exposes an API for your own app, which means external services can make calls to your app to get data from your database or even trigger workflows. And in the reverse, you can of course do the same by making API requests to outside services. That way you can receive data or you can make things happen in other applications. So all of these tools that we're going to look at in this video will serve both capabilities. You may not need to work with all of them, it just depends on what you're building. So let's start with one of the most powerful tools that we have here, which is the API connector. This is technically a plugin that you would install into your app. Okay, so you need to go to your plugins tab and then search for the API connector. You can click add plugins here and you can find it. It's usually at the top of the list and install it. This is a free plugin that is provided by Bubble. Now, what this allows you to do is to create API connections to the outside world. Any external service that offers an API, you should be able to connect to it. Bubble supports all of the standard authentication methods and capabilities for working with APIs. Okay. Now, typically you will use this only to communicate with other services, but technically you can also use this to connect to other Bubble apps, because at the end of the day, communicating with another Bubble app is just like communicating to another service. It's an API connection. But Bubble does have a separate plugin that you should be aware of called the Bubble App Connector for that purpose only, right? It is like a slimmed down version of the API connector. Bubble does a little bit more of the heavy lifting for you in terms of configuring the authentication and just the settings to get them connected. So you can connect to other Bubble apps with either of these tools, but the API connector is the only one that you would have available to you to connect to the outside world. We actually cover both of these in more detail in other lessons, so take a look at that if you're interested in working with these. Now, the next setting I want to look at is under the Settings tab here and then your API sub-tab. This is where you can expose your app's own API. And there's two versions of your API. You have your workflow API and your data API. You don't have to expose them at all. You can expose one if you want, or you can expose both of them if you want. Just depends on what you're doing. The first one is your workflow API. Now, what this will do is open up your app's backend workflows. This is going to appear here in your page drop-down list. So your backend workflows is a place for you to create workflows that not only you can trigger internally, so you can have buttons on your pages, and just like triggering a regular workflow on any of your pages, your app can also trigger its own backend workflows internally. You can also have external services trigger workflows here. Right? So for example, let's say you've integrated with a payment system and you want to be updated anytime a payment is successful or a payment failed. So that external service can make a call to one of your backend workflows here that you set up. Okay, it's very similar to page workflows. And then you can do whatever you want from it or with it from there, right? You're going to get all the data that comes from that external service, and then you can run actions like normal. You can send emails, you can update data in your database. Okay, so both external services and your own app can internally trigger these workflows. If you're going to trigger something internally, this is a very powerful area. In fact, you can do a lot of bulk operations here. You can run workflows on a loop. You can schedule things to happen in the future. This is not just for external services to work with. Okay, it's a very powerful tool, even just for your own app's needs. Now, the backend workflows area technically has a few different types of triggers that you can set up. So the most common is just a regular API workflow. Just think of it as a normal trigger event from, like you have in your page workflows. These endpoints can also accept data. We'll go over working with backend workflows in more detail in a separate lesson, but this is going to be the most common one that you use. The next type of event you have here is the recurring event. This is one that is not used very frequently because Bubble has since enabled a more powerful capability within the regular workflow to basically do everything this can do and more. So this used to be here from the very beginning in order to create events on a frequency, so daily events, weekly events, monthly events. But you can now achieve the same capability with the regular API workflow by having it schedule itself, so it's running in a loop at whatever interval you'd like. You can do it on a minute-by-minute basis, even seconds. You have much, much more control over the timing, and you're not restricted to a specific plan for the frequency. You do have to be on a paid plan in order to run backend workflows in general, but the recurring event is locked off to different plan tiers to run more frequently. You don't even need to use this to get a highly frequent recursive workflow as long as you're going to leverage the looping capability with the API workflow. Again, we'll go over this in a separate lesson, so with examples, and you'll see what I mean there. So honestly, the last time I've used this, it's probably been years. I've never had to use this event here. It's kind of, I would consider it as a phased out type of event, but that's what it's there for. The database trigger event is a special type of listener that Bubble has where it's waiting for some change to happen in your database. So basically you would say, okay, wait for a status update to happen on my job listing record, right? So if we had a field on the job listing data type that is a status, like it's an option set, whenever a status changes for any record, this will trigger automatically. And the cool thing about this event is that you actually have access to the state of that record before it changed, and then the state of the record after it changed, because that can help you consolidate, a sequence of actions that need to happen regardless of what the change was, versus having to locate everywhere in your application, especially if it can happen in multiple places, where a status would change and having to keep up with, the same sequence of actions to respond to that change. You can have everything just funnel into this one backend workflow that's always waiting for that change to occur. Really, really powerful, especially if you plan on logging things, creating records anytime something has happened, keeping track of, date and times of when things have changed. So that, if there's documentation that needs to occur for modifications to a record, it's very, very useful for that. So that's your backend workflow. And the only way you get access to that is if you enable this setting here in your settings area. The other setting that you have is enabling your data API. So this is going to expose, we'll take a look at what this message is saying here in a moment, but this is going to expose your app's data entries. So external services can actually reach your data. They can read your tables and get all of the information that's being saved there. Now, of course, you have multiple levels of security that you can add to this so that these external services have to be authorized. They can only see specific data types. They can only do certain things via the API. Maybe they can read the data, but they can't create it or modify it or delete it. We have a separate lesson that will go over API privacy in full, so I won't spend too much time talking about that. But just so that you know here, when you're exposing your database API, you still have to expose intentionally the data types. It's not an all or nothing thing. I don't have to turn on every single data type to the API. I can say maybe just the job listing. And once I do expose that, now I have more capability in my privacy rules to create more security here. So for example, if I create a rule, like this, right? Now I have these checkboxes to be more specific. Okay, maybe this person has access to the job listing via API, but how far do I want them to go? Do I want them to be able to create job listing records via API? Because Bubble does expose that capability, but you have control over whether you turn that on or off for your external services that are reaching this endpoint. You'll also see that Bubble gives you the root domain for accessing these. So just like whenever you're making a call to an external service, you have to make a request to a specific address. So these are the addresses for your own API. Now these are the root URLs, so you do have to provide the name of the workflow after this. So for example, WF stands for workflow, / and then the name of an endpoint. Let's say, payment confirmed is some workflow we want triggered. So I would say WF / payment confirmed. That's the full URL of that address that the external service would need to call. Or if they wanted to go retrieve data from my job listing table, it would be this full root domain or this full root URL, OBJ, which stands for object, then / then the name of your data type, / job listing without a space, or / user to get to the user table. All right. So again, we'll go over in a separate lesson around everything you need to know for API privacy, because there are lots of different settings that all need to kind of work together. But that's what these settings here will do, is expose those APIs. Now, one other, or actually I should say two other things here that you want to be aware of is that you have the ability to create API tokens. This is again part of privacy, but I wanted to point out that this is where it happens. This is where you can give other services their own API key so that they can be authorized whenever they're going to make calls to you. If they don't have that key, they're unauthorized. All right, so you can require a key if you want. This setting here allows you to set up your Bubble application as a login provider. So think of whenever you sign up to a new app or a new website, and you have the option sometimes to sign up with your Google account or your Facebook account. So you can actually do the same thing with your Bubble app. Users who have signed up to your application can log in to other applications with the credentials that they've created in this app. Okay, so you can configure your app to be a login provider. So you are the Google, you are the Facebook in this case. This is a more advanced capability, but it's a really powerful one, especially if you have multiple applications that need to be connected and you want your users to kind of have shared access and not to have to manage multiple passwords to all of these different sites and these different apps. Okay, now the next thing I want to go over are just a few non-Bubble tools that can help you with testing and troubleshooting even your API connections. The first one is Postman. This is a very popular tool for testing API calls. It's kind of a standalone tool where you would set up your calls, you set up all the parameters, and you'll see all of the details in the response. If there's an error, it will explain to you what might be missing. It supports practically every type of authentication system, every type of formatting for making API calls. It's incredibly robust. They have some light versions, they have some paid versions, so this is the most popular one. Now, if you don't want to spend too much time figuring out a really feature-rich tool like this, I also recommend this Chrome extension. So it's much more lightweight. It's nothing to download to your computer. It's free. And it's called Talend API Tester. So you can search for this in the Chrome extensions library. And this basically does the same thing. You know, you can set up your API calls to retrieve data from your applications or to trigger things to happen in your applications, right? A very, very powerful tool. Once you go over some of our other lessons around creating calls, it will become much more obvious how to work with these, because these are essentially what you see in the API connector. The API connector is an API tool to make those connections. That's all that Postman and Talend are as well. It's just that these live outside of Bubble, so if you want to kind of act like an external service, it can be helpful for seeing things from that perspective. It can also help you confirm, you know, if you ever run into an error, that it's not coming from Bubble. It can help you isolate that. If you also see the error here, then you know that there's not an issue with, you know, the Bubble API connector or anything within the Bubble platform. The next tool that I want to show you is this really lightweight JSON validator tool. So a lot of times when you're working with API data, let me show you an example here. This is our REST countries. You're going to see information formatted like this. This is a JSON structure. Let me go to another quick example here. Let's actually go to let's go to this one here so we can see the format for this endpoint. All right, so all of this data here for this call that we've made with the keyword united, it's all structured in JSON format. Now, the more you work with JSON formatted data, the more you'll pick up on the rules around creating the data hierarchy. So the keys with the values, where the commas need to be, where the apostrophes need to be. And this validator tool will help you understand if it's formatted properly. So I imagine if I'm going to copy this, it should all be perfectly formatted. Okay, I'm just going to paste that in there, validate, and it looks right here. We get valid JSON in green that tells us everything is good to go. It also kind of spaces things out differently so that it's easier to read. This is much, much more legible because we see all the hierarchies of the nested objects and the arrays, in other words, the lists of things. compared to this big block of text, which can be hard to parse through. Now, take a look at this. If I have one mistake, let's say I remove this comma, okay, and try to validate it, instantly I have an error, and this validator is going to tell me what's going on, where that error is. We can see it was expecting this EOF stands for end of function, so it was expecting one of these things here, comma, but it saw that it received a string. Basically what it saw was it was coming up on this next line here. Okay, so again, this is something that you'll have to you know, get used to, work with a lot more. Let me try to get this back here, validate, there we go. And if you start with simple API calls, you know, you won't have a lot of information here. It'll just be very basic, and you'll get more familiar with the format of it. It's a very standard structure, JSON format is, so no matter what API you're working with, if they provide the data in JSON, you know how to work with the structure already, okay? So those are our tools and settings to be aware of. Quick recap, we've got the API connector to connect to external services, the Bubble app connector, which is very similar to the API connector, but it's specifically for connecting two Bubble apps together. It does some more heavy lifting for you. You can also connect to the Bubble, or you can connect to other Bubble apps with the API connector as well, if you want to have a little bit more custom control around everything. In order to expose your app's own APIs, both the backend workflows and your database, you need to check these boxes here under the settings tab and then the API sub tab. If you need to generate API keys for external services to have them be authorized, you want to click on that button there. You can create as many as you'd like, create these labels so that you can keep track of which key belongs to which service. Okay, and then once you're in the backend workflows, you have a couple of different events that you can work with, but the normal API workflow is the most common. And this has a setting here to, I don't think I even went through these in this video, but we'll touch on them real quick here. These have a few authentication settings as well. So exposing an endpoint will allow an external service to call it. If you're only going to use this internally, then you do not need to turn that on. You also have the capability to say, hey, I want to require an API key or I don't. Okay, so if you leave that unchecked, it's going to require authentication. You can also have Bubble bypass the privacy rules for anything that's related in the workflow. So if you have a creation of a record or you're searching for records that have privacy rules on them, if this is something that, you know, no matter what, if it's going through this backend workflow and should ignore it, then you can check that box. Otherwise, you know, it can honor the privacy rules as you've defined them in the data tab, okay? All right, now in the next few videos, we'll go over these different tools and settings in more detail so you can actually see how to work with things with plenty of examples. We'll see you there.